Welcome to Shadow Fable. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy unsettling tales that creep beneath the skin. Tonight's story begins with an antique puppet, but this isn't a tale of childish fun or old-world charm. This is about control, and losing it completely. The first time Marcus Reeves saw the marionette, it was hanging in the corner of a cluttered estate shop in rural Pennsylvania, half hidden behind a coat rack and a chipped Victorian mirror. He almost didn't notice it, the way its eyes were too glassy, the way its carved smile seemed a little too wide. It was grotesquely human in its craftsmanship, with delicate wooden hands, painted lips that curled just enough to be unsettling, and joints that had clearly been repaired dozens of times. Marcus had never owned a puppet before. He was a woodworker by trade, a lifelong bachelor nearing 50, known in his small town for restoring old furniture with a surgeon's care. He had a quiet life, methodical and peaceful, but something about the marionette caught him off guard. A sense of nostalgia he couldn't place, like seeing a face you're certain you've dreamt before. He asked the shopkeeper how much it was. The woman, an older lady with a face like dry bark, paused for a beat too long. "You sure you want that one?" she asked, her tone half warning, half amused. Marcus chuckled awkwardly. "I don't know, I guess I just like the craftsmanship." "It came from an old theater that burned down," she added, as if tossing out trivia. "No name, no record, just turned up in a box of salvaged props." He took it home that afternoon. The puppet was heavier than it looked. The strings were tangled, the wood dusty and faded, but the joints moved smoothly, disturbingly smoothly. The more he examined it, the more impressed he became. The facial features were hand-carved but precise. The eyes were made of glass, yet deep enough that he swore he caught reflections where there shouldn't have been any light. Marcus cleaned it up, trimmed the frayed strings, and hung it on a beam in his workshop. He didn't intend to use it. It was more of a conversation piece, or so he told himself. But that night, as he sat in bed with a book, he found himself glancing at the hallway where the dim light from his workshop crept into the living room. He knew the puppet was in there, swaying slightly from the draft. That night, he dreamt of wood and fire, of strings tightening around his wrists. He didn't sleep well. Over the next few days, small things began to change. He found the marionette in slightly different positions, not moved far, just subtle differences. A tilted head, legs dangling a few inches apart when they were together the day before. Once, its mouth was slightly open. He told himself it was gravity. The strings must have loosened. He adjusted them, rehung the puppet, tried to forget the dreams, which were now growing more vivid, long hallways lined with faceless figures on strings, a stage where he stood frozen, watching his own body bow to applause he couldn't hear. Then came the voice. It started faint, just a murmur, almost like background noise. The kind of sound you could mistake for a neighbor's TV or a breeze through an old vent. But one evening, as he was sanding a chair leg in his workshop, he heard it more clearly. "Don't let them cut the strings." He froze, looked around. Nothing. The marionette hung silently in the corner, its painted eyes reflecting the yellow bulb overhead. He told himself it was the radio, though it hadn't been turned on. By the end of the week, he started dreaming with his eyes open. It happened while he was brushing his teeth. He looked up into the mirror and saw his reflection smiling, wide, too wide, though his own face was still. Behind him, the marionette stood on the counter like a perched bird, one wooden hand raised to his shoulder. He snapped out of it a moment later, toothpaste dripping from his chin, alone in the bathroom. He laughed shakily. Too many late nights. He needed a break. He moved the puppet to a storage closet and shut the door. That night, the closet door was open. Marcus stood in the hall in the dark, staring at the marionette, which now rested in the center of the floor. Its legs were splayed like it had fallen, or been placed. The room was cold, unnaturally cold. He didn't pick it up, just shut the door again, jammed a towel at the base, and turned every light in the house on. Sleep became a stranger. His hands began to tremble. He'd lose time in the workshop, finding half-finished pieces he didn't remember starting. He tried to throw the puppet away, once. Drove to a river 30 minutes out of town, wrapped it in a garbage bag, and tossed it into the current. He heard it laugh. Not out loud, not in the air, in his head. A wet, clicking laugh, like wood tapping against wood. He drove home in silence, shaking. The next morning, it was back, hanging from the beam. But now there were more strings. They weren't attached to the marionette. They were attached to the ceiling. He followed them with his eyes, confused, until he realized they weren't new strings. They were shadows, and they ended on him, on his arms, his legs, his neck. He stopped eating, stopped going outside. The dreams became performances, elaborate stage shows where Marcus was the puppet, moving in stuttering jerks while a silent audience watched from the dark. Sometimes he heard the whisper of applause, sometimes just breathing. And then one night the dream changed. He was backstage, alone. The marionette sat in front of a mirror, brushing its carved hair with a wooden comb. It looked at him, slowly, and it said, "You're ready." The next morning, Marcus didn't get out of bed. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, feeling something unfamiliar in his limbs. Not exactly pain, but weight, a sluggishness, like his body no longer answered him with the same immediacy. When he finally sat up, he noticed a faint red line around his wrist, a small indentation, as though something thin and taut had rested there overnight. His thoughts drifted more than they used to. He'd start a task, boiling water, sanding a table leg, and find himself staring at nothing, sometimes for minutes, sometimes longer. The kettle would scream. The wood would smoke from over-sanding. He'd wake as if from a trance. Each time, the marionette was near, watching. Eventually, he moved it again, not out of fear, not really, but to give it a better view. It sat on a stool now, just beside his workbench, hands resting gently on its knees, strings draped loosely from the rafters above. Marcus didn't question how they had gotten there. That day, he found himself speaking aloud as he worked. "Maybe you were waiting for someone to see you," he said softly, smoothing a groove into a headboard. "People leave things behind too easily." He looked over his shoulder. The puppet hadn't moved, but he felt a response. Not words, an impression, like warmth from a fire that wasn't burning. That night, he slept without dreams. But in the morning, when he walked past the hallway mirror, he stopped. His reflection wasn't right. His shoulders hung too loosely, his neck tilted slightly left, like it wasn't holding his head with intent, but rather as a suggestion. Most disturbingly, his hands twitched once, just once, before falling still. He reached out and touched the glass. It felt cold, too cold. Something had shifted inside him, and he knew it. There was no dramatic possession, no sharp turn toward madness, just a gradual drift, a tethering. He began to feel safest when the puppet was near. It was, in a way, the only thing that saw him now. His phone collected dust. Neighbors stopped knocking. When a friend from town, Al, who'd known Marcus since they were teenagers, stopped by to check in, Marcus didn't answer the door, but he did listen from the other side. He could hear Al's voice muffled through the wood. "You in there, buddy? I saw your truck out front. You okay?" Silence. Al knocked again, then muttered something about coming back later. Marcus didn't move. He just watched the marionette, which now hung again, no longer perched, no longer sitting, suspended from the ceiling by its strings. It swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. Later that evening, Marcus found himself writing. He didn't remember sitting down with a pen, but when he blinked, there it was. A notepad filled with small, neat letters he couldn't recall forming. They weren't instructions, not exactly, just guidance. Face the crowd. Stop resisting. You were never the one pulling the strings. He stared at the final line for a long time. He didn't leave the house for days after that. The dreams stopped entirely, replaced by waking hallucinations, though even that word felt wrong. They didn't feel like hallucinations. They felt real. Soundless stage lights warming his skin, curtains closing in the corners of his vision, the unmistakable pressure of strings tightening at the back of his neck when he resisted too much. He began rehearsing, not consciously, but his movements became smoother, as if choreographed. When he reached for tools, it was with a dancer's precision. When he walked through his home, it was like he was gliding on a track. And always, always, the marionette watched. Sometimes it hung, sometimes it sat. Once, Marcus found it curled up on his bed like a sleeping child. He tucked it in. One morning, perhaps it was morning, time had started to collapse. He walked past a mirror again, but this time he didn't stop. He saw something that wasn't him. It had his face, but the smile was deeper, and the eyes gleamed like polished glass. Behind it, dozens of puppets dangled, their silhouettes swaying in a theater of shadows. He reached up to touch his face, and felt a string. It was thin, almost invisible. He tried to pull it, but his hand froze midair, hovering, trembling. He couldn't complete the motion. Something inside him held back. That night, the audience came. Not physically, not in any visible form, but Marcus felt them, hundreds, maybe thousands of unseen eyes fixed on him, applauding without sound, holding their breath. He stood in the center of his living room. The lights dimmed. He bowed. A spotlight, though no lamp or bulb hung above, illuminated the space around him. Marcus's living room was gone, or perhaps transformed. The floor beneath him felt like aged wood, the kind used in old theaters, hollow and resonant with the weight of movement. Shadows gathered at the edge of the light, soft at first, then pressing inward like curtains tightening. He didn't feel afraid. That realization came to him slowly, like water warming to a boil. He should have been terrified. But standing there, head bowed, he felt peace, or something that passed for it. The kind of numbness that comes after days of sleeplessness, after a life of restraint and quiet, always keeping things contained, precise, predictable. Now he was here, and someone else was pulling the strings. From the darkness behind him came the faint tap, tap, tap of wooden feet against the stage. Marcus didn't turn. He didn't need to. He knew it was the marionette. Its steps were light but deliberate, like a performer entering for the final act. It moved until it stood beside him, just at the edge of his vision, where light met shadow. He didn't need to see its face. He already knew it was smiling. A sound swelled around them, soft at first, like the rustle of fabric or breath caught in throats. Applause, distant, restrained, reverent. The audience was still hidden, but their approval pulsed in the air like heat. Marcus lifted his head. His arms rose with slow, graceful tension, his joints pulling back as if lifted by unseen cords. His legs followed, shifting into a stance he hadn't chosen. Every movement was deliberate, orchestrated, and yet he was inside it, watching, feeling. The marionette stepped in front of him. It bowed to the audience, and then it turned to face him. The strings that had once held it aloft were gone. Now, they were on him. A whisper passed between them, no sound, only a knowing. It was always meant to be you. Marcus didn't reply. He couldn't. His mouth opened slightly, not wide enough to speak, just enough to let in the idea that maybe he had always been waiting. That maybe the quiet of his life, the routines, the woodwork, the long silences and dusty corners, maybe it was all leading here. The marionette reached out. Its wooden hand touched his chest, gently, and then it stepped into him. Not like a possession. There was no violence, no scream, no rush of dark energy. It was a merger, smooth and clean. The weight of its form folded into his own, like a costume being zipped closed, like stepping into a memory that was always his. Marcus's eyes blinked once, and when they opened again, the stage was empty. The lights dimmed, the curtains fell. And in the real world, what was left of it, a man stood motionless in his workshop, smiling faintly beneath the dim glow of a single yellow bulb. In his hands, he held the marionette, or rather, what was left of it, its body now limp, hollow, like the shell had been used up. He hung it gently on the beam where it once had been. Then he turned and walked deeper into the house. Not like before, not like Marcus. His steps were graceful, timed, rehearsed, as though someone else were still pulling the strings. It began with the sound of dripping water, not loud but persistent, somewhere just beyond the edge of hearing, like the ticking of a distant clock you can't find. Noah Briggs had always been a light sleeper, the kind of man who woke at the smallest creak, who scanned the dark for reasons he couldn't explain. But this was different. This wasn't sleep. He was aware of his body, but not in the way you'd expect. He felt around it, like a fog swirling just beyond the edges of something solid. He couldn't move, couldn't open his eyes. But the strange part, he wasn't afraid, not yet. Somewhere, machines hummed. Rhythmic beeps punctuated the quiet like mechanical heartbeats. Noah didn't know where he was, but he knew he wasn't alone. There was a presence, not a voice, not a shadow. Just the feeling of being watched by something patient, something that didn't blink. He tried to speak. Nothing. His throat burned, dry and unused. And then faintly, a whisper, one he couldn't place. "It's not time yet." Noah didn't know if it came from inside his head or from the darkness around him, but it chilled him. Because it didn't feel like a comfort, it felt like a warning. Days, or what he assumed were days, passed this way. Darkness, the quiet machinery of life, and sometimes the presence, always lingering, always just outside his reach. And then, one day, something changed. The darkness flickered. Just once. A flash, like a slide projected onto his closed eyes. His childhood home, the yellow wallpaper in the hallway, the crooked photo of his father holding a fish at the lake, the smell of dust and lemon cleaner. Then, Darkness again. Noah's thoughts became erratic, fragmented. He tried to hold on to the image, tried to push toward it, but the fog pushed back. More flashes followed, each sharper, more intrusive. His ex-wife's laugh, his daughter's birthday party, his mother crying at a hospital bedside. They weren't memories, they were intrusions, forced upon him. Slivers of glass pressed into his mind. The presence grew bolder, closer. He couldn't see it, but he could feel its breath. Not warm, not human, just there. And one night, as the memory of his daughter's 6th birthday faded, he heard the voice again. "You're close." The words were laced with something oily, like it enjoyed this. That night, he dreamed. But it wasn't a normal dream. It had structure. A hallway, white, endless. The floor polished, reflecting overhead fluorescence that didn't buzz. He walked, not because he wanted to, but because something compelled him forward. Each footstep echoed like thunder in the sterile quiet. Doors lined the hall, identical, each with a number. He stopped at 237. The door pulsed faintly, like it had a heartbeat. Inside, a hospital room. Himself lying motionless. Tubes, beeping machines. A woman, his sister, sitting beside the bed, eyes swollen from crying. Then the door slammed shut behind him. A second door appeared, 402. This one opened to his childhood bedroom. The bed unmade. A stuffed rabbit on the floor. The scent of baby powder and fear. He heard breathing, deep, wrong. He turned. Nothing. But the rabbit was gone. He backed out slowly. The hallway had grown darker, narrower. He was being guided, but not by anything kind. Noah tried to stop, to scream, but his body obeyed something else. He passed more doors. Some showed faces he didn't remember. Others didn't open, but he heard things behind them. Whispers, laughter, scraping. And then, room 0. The door was larger, ancient. Wood, not metal. Carved with symbols he didn't recognize. No handle, just a keyhole. And somehow, Noah knew the key was him. His memories, his fears, his guilt. He stepped forward, and the door swallowed him. Noah fell, not through space but through thought. Memories spiraling, fears made flesh. He saw himself yelling at his daughter, slamming a door. Felt the guilt when she wouldn't speak to him for a week. He saw his father's funeral, the regret for things unsaid. He saw his own face reflected in a rearview mirror just before the screech of tires. And then nothing. Silence. Then a room, small, familiar. Noah sat across from himself. The other Noah was calm, smiling. "We've been waiting." Noah tried to speak, but his voice was gone. The other leaned forward. "You don't get to leave yet." Suddenly, he understood. This place, it fed on consciousness, on minds caught between life and death. Each door had been someone else. Some stayed forever. Some escaped, broken. The presence? It wasn't a ghost. It was the collector. It lived in the cracks of consciousness, in the folds of coma dreams, feeding. Noah tried to run, but the floor melted into liquid thought, pulling him down. He screamed, silently, violently, and woke, sort of. His eyes opened. Fluorescent lights. A nurse gasped. Machines beeped wildly. "Noah? Can you hear me?" His sister sobbed beside him, clutching his hand. Doctors flooded in. He was back, alive, whole. They said it was a miracle. 3 weeks in a coma, and then, just like that, awake. He smiled, thanked them, said he remembered nothing. But he did. Every door, every whisper, every scream. And that night, as he lay in the hospital bed, he saw the corner of the room twitch. Just a flicker, a ripple in the shadow, and a whisper, "You brought us with you." Noah didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The room was too quiet, too still, as if holding its breath. The machines beeped rhythmically beside him, but each sound seemed to arrive a second too late, just slightly out of sync with time itself. Like the world was pretending to be normal, but something behind the curtain had lost the rhythm. He stared at the corner where the shadow had twitched. It didn't move again. Not yet, but he knew it would. By morning, his vitals had stabilized. The nurses were chipper, amazed by his recovery. His sister brought coffee and old photos, her eyes red-rimmed but glowing. He tried to smile for her, pretend. But when she showed him a picture of their mother, he felt a jolt, because he remembered her in the hallway, room 402, sitting in that chair, holding the rabbit. He hadn't seen her in 10 years, hadn't thought of that room in 20. But the smell, the baby powder, was real. Too real. Memories, he realized, were no longer private. They had been opened, and something had crawled through. Back home, things didn't get better. They got stranger. It started with the mirrors. He'd pass by them just in the corner of his eye, and his reflection would linger. Not move, just hesitate. At first, he told himself it was trauma, recovery hallucinations. But one night in the bathroom, he caught the reflection looking directly at him. Eyes locked, and it smiled. Only he wasn't smiling. He slammed the cabinet shut. The reflection was gone, but from that night on, he stopped using mirrors. And then, the hallway. The same one from the dream, long, white, sterile. He'd see it when he closed his eyes. Sometimes, even when he hadn't, he'd turn a corner in his house and for a split second, the world would change. The hallway would be there, waiting, and the doors were multiplying. He kept seeing numbers, street signs, receipts, his coffee machine flashing 237, his thermostat stuck on 0. His daughter texted him once, "Hey, did we ever stay in room 402 at that lodge near Lake Arrowhead?" He hadn't told her anything. He didn't want to tell her. But the dream had followed him, not just as memory, but as blueprint. One night, he awoke to a knock at the front door. 3:07 a.m. He peered out. No one there. But the porch light flickered. And at the bottom of the steps, written in sidewalk chalk, "It's still not time." Noah tried therapy, meditation, sleep aids, but you can't medicate against what lives in the folds of reality. The dreams returned. Not every night, but often. Always the hallway. Always a new door. And each time, the door was harder to resist. They called to him. Room 518, the co-worker who died of a stroke. Room 211, the neighbor's child, gone in their sleep. Each door a mind that never came back. And behind each, something waited. Some begged, some screamed, some invited him in. He stopped answering his phone. He stopped leaving the house. Eventually, the lines blurred. He didn't know when he was awake or when he was walking the hallway again. And then, one morning, he found a key on his pillow, simple, rusted. Attached, a tag for when you're ready. That night, he sat on his bed for hours, key in hand. The hallway loomed in his mind, his personal purgatory, yes, but also a gate. He had a choice. Ignore it. Let it fade. Pretend. Or open room 0 again. Try to finish what had begun. The presence had said, "You don't get to leave yet." But what if leaving wasn't the end? What if this, all of this, was the test? He turned the key over in his hand. In the silence of 3:07 a.m., he walked to the mirror. This time, his reflection didn't flinch. It nodded and whispered, "Welcome back." They say it only comes on the full moon, the white wolf of Woodbury. A beast so silent, its paw steps make no sound, its breath barely stirs the leaves. But when it looks at you, you feel as though you've been seen, completely, as though your very soul has been measured and found lacking. People in Woodbury don't talk much about the wolf anymore. Not openly. Not since the killing stopped 15 years ago. But ask the right old man at the right bar after his second whiskey and you'll hear a different story. About the ones who disappeared. The ones who were never really right again. The ones who saw it. I used to think it was just a legend until I moved there. The house I bought was far enough from town to be quiet, but not so far as to feel isolated. It was built in the 1920s, restored just enough to make you think about ghosts, but not enough to believe in them. The kind of place you tell yourself has character. I'd just gone through a divorce, and Woodbury, with its antique shops and sleepy charm, seemed like the kind of place where a man could rebuild his life. I moved in mid-autumn. The leaves were just turning. The air had that faint bite of winter waiting. I remember the realtor, a pinched-looking woman with overly cheerful eyes, giving me the keys and muttering something under her breath. "What was that?" I asked. She smiled too quickly. "Nothing, just, if you hear anything at night, don't go outside." I laughed, assuming it was some rural inside joke. "Coyotes?" She looked at me for a beat too long. "Sure." The first few weeks were uneventful. Quiet mornings, long walks, evenings spent reading by the fireplace. My nearest neighbor was a retired mechanic named Hank, who lived about half a mile down the road. He stopped by once or twice, brought me firewood, offered to show me how to winterize the pipes. "You're lucky," he said one evening, glancing out toward the woods as he sipped his coffee. "Place like this, peaceful, as long as you mind the full moons." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the white wolf?" "I've heard the rumors." He didn't smile. "Not a rumor, just not what people like to talk about anymore." "What is it then?" Hank took a breath. "It's not a wolf, not really, you'll see." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of the conversation. Weird, local legends didn't scare me. But because there was something about the way Hank had said, "You'll see." Like it wasn't a warning, like it was a guarantee. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. Not a howl, just movement. Slow, heavy movement in the woods behind the house. I sat up in bed listening. My bedroom window overlooked the backyard, and beyond that, the tree line. I didn't turn on the light, I just watched. Something pale moved between the trees. It was large, larger than any dog I'd seen, and it didn't walk like one either. It moved with precision, like it was searching. But the strangest part was the silence. Even at night, you expect crickets, the occasional owl. But when it appeared, everything else stopped. I must have stood at that window for 20 minutes. The pale shape circled the yard twice, never coming close, never looking up. And then, as suddenly as it came, it was gone. The next morning, I wrote it off. My eyes playing tricks. Moonlight, shadows. Maybe a deer with mange. I almost believed that until I found the footprints. Huge, clean prints in the soft earth, right up to the edge of the porch, as if it had stood there for a while, watching. I tried to forget. Told myself it was nothing. But the next full moon, it returned. This time, it did look up. Its eyes weren't red, they weren't glowing. They were just human. Not literally, but there was an awareness in them, and not a kind one. It stared at me for what felt like hours, not moving, not blinking. And then it tilted its head just slightly before disappearing into the trees. I started locking my bedroom door at night. The following week, I went into town, visited the local library, asked about the wolf. The librarian was in her 70s with hair the color of snow and hands that trembled slightly when she turned pages. When I mentioned the wolf, she froze. "You saw it?" "I think so. 2 nights now, full moons." She looked down. "It picks people." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You're not from here. You don't know. The wolf doesn't show itself to everyone. It chooses, watches, follows. And if it keeps coming back, well, I'd suggest you leave." "Leave town?" "Leave the house," she whispered. "Leave the woods before it gets inside." That night, I didn't sleep at all. Not just because of what she said, but because deep down, something in me believed her. I started noticing changes. I'd wake up in the middle of the night already standing at the window, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. I'd find my back door unlocked when I was certain I'd locked it. I began dreaming of the wolf, its eyes, its breath on my neck, its voice in my ear. It never spoke words, just sounds, but I understood them. It was hungry, not for meat, for fear, for presence. It wanted to be remembered. I began keeping a journal. I wrote down everything, the times I saw it, the dreams, the noises. Each entry became more frantic, less coherent. Some mornings, I'd find pages torn out and burned in the fireplace. I live alone. One afternoon, Hank showed up again, unannounced, just knocked on the door and stood there, hat in hand. "I had to check on you," he said. "I'm fine," I lied. He looked around the house, then leaned in. "It's been inside, hasn't it?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He nodded slowly. "I've seen it happen before. You've got to break the pattern. Get away during the next full moon, just one night. It resets something." It sounded like madness, but I was desperate enough to try. So, the next full moon, I packed a bag and drove. I didn't care where. I just drove until the trees thinned out and I saw motels and gas stations. I booked a room and waited. Nothing happened. I didn't dream. I didn't wake up sweating. When I returned home the next day, the house felt lighter. For the first time in months, I believed I'd broken whatever spell I'd fallen under. Until that evening. There was something on my porch. Not the wolf. Something worse. A photograph. It was old, faded, black and white. A group of people standing outside what looked like my house, though the porch was different. 10, maybe 12 people, staring straight into the camera. Their eyes had been scratched out. On the back, in shaky handwriting, "You forgot to ask who built the house." I stared at the photo for a long time. My hands were trembling, but I couldn't bring myself to set it down. The faces, though eyeless, seemed familiar. Not as individuals, but as shapes that had haunted my dreams. Their outlines had appeared behind trees, in mirrors. in the shadows of my room. But I'd never seen them this clearly before. I flipped the photo over again. The note on the back felt colder now, heavier, like the ink had sunk through more than just paper. You forgot to ask who built the house. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, the TV muted. Every so often, I thought I heard movement in the walls, not mice, heavier, rhythmic, almost like footsteps. By morning, something in me shifted. I drove straight to the town's historical society, a dusty one-room building behind the courthouse that no one seemed to visit anymore. The man inside was ancient, skin like yellowed paper, cataract-clouded eyes that still managed to pin me in place when I asked about my address. He said nothing at first, just got up, went into a back room, and came out with a leather-bound ledger. He flipped pages until he landed on one entry, then set it down in front of me. "Built in 1923, he rasped, by a man named Eli Covener. Why does that matter?" He looked up at me. "Because Eli wasn't a man." I blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Not in the way you mean," he continued. "Eli was sensitive. He built the house as a marker, a tether, to them. People disappeared, animals too. Everyone assumed it was wolves back then, but not the kind that walk on four legs." He pointed to the page again. Next to Eli's name was a single phrase, circled in what looked like charcoal. "The offering remains as long as the house stands." I left the building without a word. The whole town felt different now, darker, smaller, like it had pulled inward on itself, like it knew I was trying to leave the story it wanted to keep me in. That night, I had another dream. The house was gone, just trees, open sky, and the wolf, standing where the porch used to be. Only, it wasn't quite a wolf. Its shape flickered in and out, sometimes bipedal, sometimes crawling. Its face was a blur of fur, bone, and human sorrow. It walked toward me and whispered a single word, spoken in a voice that echoed with hundreds of others layered underneath. "Stay!" I woke up screaming. My hands were dirty. My feet were muddy. The front door was wide open. I decided then I had to burn the house down. It wasn't rational, it wasn't even legal, but some primitive part of me was screaming that fire was the only thing left, the only language this presence might understand. I waited until nightfall, poured gasoline in the corners, across the floors, up the stairs. The air itself felt like it was resisting, like the walls were breathing. And then I struck the match. At first, nothing. Then a faint hiss. Not from the flames, but from behind me. The wolf stood in the doorway, inside the house, watching the fire with eyes that were no longer human, no longer animal, just ancient. And it smiled. Not with lips or teeth, but with its entire presence. I felt it inside my skull, a pressure behind my eyes. "You break the house," it seemed to say without sound, "and you become the tether." The flames roared up suddenly, a heat so intense I staggered backward. The wolf remained where it was, unbothered, fading slowly as the fire consumed everything. I ran. I don't remember how far. Only that I didn't stop until the trees thinned, and I could no longer smell the smoke. The fire made the news the next day. Electrical fault, they claimed. No one hurt, no one ever mentioned the wolf. I moved states, changed my name, got a job that doesn't ask questions. But some nights, on the full moon, I still wake up around 3 a.m. And outside my window, wherever I live, I swear I can see something pale just beyond the trees. Watching. Waiting. Because maybe I didn't destroy the house, Maybe I just moved it inside me. My name is Claire Sanderson. I've taught history to high school seniors in northern Pennsylvania for the past 23 years. It's a quiet district, a town surrounded by rusted barns and old maples, where kids still say "ma'am" and hang their dreams on football scores. Most days blend into one another, a haze of lectures, graded papers, and half-hearted essays about World War II. But 2 years ago, something happened in my classroom that I still can't explain. Something I think about every single night before I sleep. It was early October, and I'd assigned a new project. Something creative to break through their seniorities. The instructions were simple. Interview a relative about a major historical event they lived through and present it as a living history project. I encouraged recordings, photos, even journals. I wanted them to feel connected to the past, not just regurgitate it. The projects trickled in, some better than others. Grandfathers talking about Vietnam, a mother's memory of September 11th. But one stood out the moment it landed on my desk. It was from a student named Henry Marsden. Quiet kid, pale, wiry, always wore the same washed-out hoodie no matter the weather. He had this way of looking at you like he was watching something just behind your head. Smart, too. Off the charts analytical, though he rarely spoke unless called on. His project wasn't like the others. It came in a plain black binder with no title, just a single sticky note on top. It said, "For your eyes only." Inside was a USB drive and several neatly printed pages. The cover sheet read, "Interview with Grandfather, Everett Marsden, January 1983. At first glance, it seemed normal enough, but as I skimmed the transcript, a cold prickling started up the back of my neck. This wasn't a cheerful recounting of war stories or distant tragedies. It was a conversation between Henry's grandfather and someone, presumably Henry himself, but the tone was off. It began in the usual way. "Grandpa, what's your earliest memory of the place?" "You mean the house? Or what happened there? What happened?" Then the pauses grew longer, the responses slower, more fragmented. Everett spoke of an old farmhouse he'd lived in as a boy, somewhere in central Pennsylvania, near a patch of woods locals called Briar Hollow. The land, he said, had been wrong since his father bought it in 1947. Not cursed, exactly, just wrong in a way that bled into everything: the crops, the animals, even the air. He talked about the silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that seemed to lean in when you weren't looking, the way the wind never touched the trees in Briar Hollow, how birds avoided the northern window of the house. "I was 7 when the cellar door locked from the inside," the transcript read. "Your great-uncle went down there chasing the cat. We never found either one." I paused, expecting embellishment. Rural ghost stories were nothing new, but Everett's words, captured in type, had a disturbing precision. Not drama, not flair, just cold, clinical observation. Next came a photograph, taped behind the transcript. It was old, sepia-toned, faded. 3 children stood in front of a stone well. All were expressionless. The boy on the left, presumably young Everett, had his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something far away. I squinted. Behind the well, half obscured by a bare tree, was a figure. At first, I assumed it was a shadow, but the more I looked, the more it took shape. Tall, thin, with something like antlers. No, not antlers. Branches. The file on the USB included an audio recording. I hesitated. I was alone in my classroom. Late. The janitor had already passed by once. Still, I pressed play. Everett's voice crackled through the speakers, gravelly, slow, heavy with breath. "It never left," he said. "It just changed where it sleeps." "What do you mean?" Henry asked. "It goes quiet when no one looks, but it don't go away. It waits. It listens." A thud. Static. Then it came back when I was 13, looked like my mother that time. "Did she see it too?" "She's the one that let it in." I stopped the audio. There was something unnatural about the rhythm of the conversation, like it wasn't entirely a memory being relayed, but something else. Something still happening. The next day, I called Henry to my desk after class. "Where did you get this interview?" I asked. He looked at me with those sharp, unblinking eyes. "I recorded it when I was 10, before he died." "Why did you say, for your eyes only?" "Because he said it wouldn't like being heard." He walked away before I could press further. That evening, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the voice, the photo, that wordless sense of dread leaking out from the transcript like smoke. Curiosity got the better of me. I reopened the file. There was a second audio clip I hadn't played. This one labeled After. I should have stopped there. I should have just graded his project and let it go. But I didn't. The clip was shorter, only 30 seconds. It started with heavy breathing. Then Henry's voice. "Grandpa, are you okay?" "It knows your name now." Click. Then silence. Not static, not background hum, just nothing. That was the first night I heard the knocking. Always at 3:17 a.m. Sharp. 3 slow knocks. No one ever at the door, no footsteps down the hall, just knocks. I told myself it was coincidence. I live alone, near the edge of town. Houses settle, pipes groan. But then I notice the trees. There's a patch of woods behind my house, normal oaks and ash, except one night, I realized none of them moved, even with wind. Even when the storm rolled through a week later, they stood still, perfectly still, like they were waiting for something. I returned the project, gave Henry an A. He didn't react, just nodded, took the binder, and left. But the next day, the file was back on my desk. Same sticky note. "For your eyes only." Inside was a new page. One sentence, typed in all caps. "IT listens through memory." That night, I deleted the files, burned the papers, tried to forget, but forgetting doesn't help. Because now, when I dream, I see the well, I see the children. And sometimes, I see myself standing among them. The dreams worsened after I burned the papers. Not nightmares in the traditional sense. No screaming, no running, no blood. Just images. Still. Heavy. Stuck. Every night I stood at the edge of that same clearing, the one from the photo. The well looked different in my dreams. Wider, darker. I could hear something breathing down there. Deep, slow breaths. Not threatening exactly, but aware. The children were always present. One night, they held hands in a circle. Another, they all turned to face me at once. Eyes wide, mouths closed. Henry was among them now. He looked older, taller. I stopped sleeping altogether. I couldn't risk it. I tried rationalizing. Maybe it was a particularly vivid case of mass suggestion. I'd read once that shared folklore could generate hallucinations in susceptible people. Or maybe Henry's project had wormed its way so deep into my subconscious that it had distorted my perception. I told myself that a seasoned educator shouldn't be shaken by some rural ghost tale. But something had changed. I started seeing reflections that weren't mine, just a glimpse, always at the edge of a window or glass pane. A tall figure in the background, not moving, watching. One afternoon, I pulled open the blinds in my classroom and found a shape burned faintly into the glass. At first, I thought it was a smudge, but it wasn't. It was too symmetrical. Two long shapes branching at the top like bone or wood. That same day, Henry didn't come to class. He never came back. I called the office, then the guidance counselor. He was marked absent with no apparent excuse. The number we had on file for his home had been disconnected. No one knew where he'd gone. A week later, the principal told us that Henry's house had been foreclosed, that he and his mother had likely left town overnight. She asked me if I'd noticed anything strange about him. I said no. I didn't tell her about the project, or the dreams, or the knocking. I didn't tell her that his empty desk made the room colder, that the reflection in the window was closer now, that every night I still heard the cellar door open even though I didn't have a cellar, that I'd started leaving out food for something I never saw. My therapist, yes, I finally got one, tells me it's guilt, that I feel responsible for a student who slipped through the cracks, that my mind is manufacturing signs and symbols to process trauma. Maybe she's right, maybe. But there's something she doesn't know. A month ago, I found a notebook in my glove compartment, one I'd never seen before. The cover was blank. Inside was a drawing. The same well, same tree. But this time, a fourth figure stood behind the children. It looked like me. Not as I am now, but younger. Much younger. In the drawing, I was the one with my head tilted, like I was listening. And when I turned the page, there was a sentence scribbled over and over in blocky, frantic handwriting. Remembering is inviting. I don't know what happened to Henry. I don't know if he drew that. But I've stopped telling people I don't believe in ghosts. Because ghosts aren't just people who died. Sometimes they're things we let in. Sometimes they start as stories. And sometimes they wait quietly in our memories, watching, listening, until we tell someone else. Until we share. So please, forget this story when it's done. Forget the well. Forget Henry. Forget the thing with the branches. Don't look out your window tonight. Don't listen for the knocking. And whatever you do, don't remember. It wasn't supposed to take more than 4 hours. That's what the park ranger had said. Easy loop, just watch for the red markers. I left the visitor's center a little after noon with a sandwich, 2 bottles of water, and a folded map in my back pocket I didn't think I'd need. The trail was simple, flat, wide, and lined with late autumn leaves that crunched underfoot like cereal. I liked hiking alone. No noise, no small talk. Just me and the sound of wind moving through trees like breath between ribs. It was when I saw the old wooden signpost that things got different. It leaned at an odd angle, the kind of crooked that didn't feel accidental. No words on it, just a faded arrow pointing left, carved in deep with something sharp. I don't know why I followed it. Curiosity, maybe. Or boredom, or maybe something deeper, more instinctive, like when you know someone's staring at you in a crowd even though you haven't seen them yet. I turned left. The forest changed almost immediately. The air grew heavier, damper, like it had rained even though the forecast was clear. The trees grew denser, closer together, their limbs low and twisted like they'd hunched over just to make walking harder. The leaves here weren't crisp. They were soft, wet, and smelled faintly of rot. Still, I didn't stop. Something about the path felt intentional. Like it was guiding me, like it was waiting. After maybe 40 minutes of walking, I came to a clearing. At the center of it, half buried in moss and leaves, was a radio. A boxy, metal-cased thing with a cracked speaker grill and a faded tuning dial. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. And yet, it was on. A low hum buzzed from the speaker. No music, no voices, just that electric, barely there static that doesn't mean anything. I crouched beside it, brushing dirt from the top. No batteries in sight, no cord. It shouldn't have been working, and that should have been enough for me to leave. But it wasn't. As I turned the dial, something clicked. A voice emerged, distant at first, like it was coming through a tunnel. Crackly, genderless, and flat. Not quite robotic, but not quite human either. "He's not where he thinks he is." I froze. It hadn't said a station name. No news, no weather. Just that. And then silence again. I waited, heart thudding. He took the wrong turn. He doesn't know yet, but he will. I looked around. The clearing was still, empty, the trees unmoving. But I swear the shadows had gotten longer, like the sun had slipped behind something it wasn't supposed to. I twisted the dial again, more static, and then, "Keep walking." The voice was closer now, clearer. It was like it knew when I was listening. My breath was shallow. I stood up, brushing dirt from my knees, and backed away. But I didn't leave. I didn't run, not yet. I don't know if I was frozen or fascinated or both. Then the voice spoke again. "Don't look behind you." It took everything in me not to obey that primal urge, to look, to see. But I didn't. Instead, I walked. Forward. Away from the clearing, away from the radio, or at least I thought I had, because 5 minutes later I found it again. Same clearing, same radio, same impossible hum. This time, the radio was already speaking. "He thinks he left, but the forest likes him. It wants him to stay." I turned and walked in the opposite direction, fast, focused. I counted my steps. I refused to look around. 37 steps, 50, 100, and still, the clearing, still, the radio, now louder. He doesn't understand. He never did, but he will. I stepped toward it and kicked it, hard, sending it tumbling across the dirt. It hit a tree trunk and landed on its side. The voice didn't stop. "He's angry now. Good, that helps." I ran, not on the trail, not toward anything, just away. But the forest didn't let me go. Trees pressed closer. Branches scraped at my arms like fingers trying to pull me back. The air felt tighter, heavier, as if the forest was breathing. Eventually, I stumbled. My foot caught on something and I fell hard onto wet leaves. As I sat up, catching my breath, the radio was beside me, not broken, not dented, just there. It crackled again. He lied to her. I blinked. What? Static. He lied. That's why he came. That's why he's here. "No," I said aloud. "No, I didn't." But my voice was shaky, weak. The radio disagreed. "He did. The trip was never about hiking. It was about escaping, about forgetting." "Shut up." The forest was silent. Then, "Tell us." "Tell her." I kicked the radio again, but this time it didn't move. I looked down. Its base was rooted into the dirt now. Twisted tendrils of moss and wire were crawling from beneath it like veins, anchoring it to the earth. It was becoming part of the forest. Or maybe it always had been. I stood and ran again. This time, I didn't stop. I ignored the pain in my legs, the scratches on my arms, the way my breath caught in my throat. I ran until the trees began to thin, until I saw light up ahead, and then, finally, I was out. Sort of. I stood at the edge of a road, asphalt, cracked, a faded yellow line down the center, no signs, no traffic. But it was something, a noise behind me. I turned slowly. No forest, just trees, normal ones, the kind that swayed in the breeze, and no radio. I breathed out, just once, a shaky, trembling breath that hurt more than it helped. I took my phone from my pocket, dead, of course, and started walking along the road. North, I guessed, maybe east. It didn't matter, I just wanted out. And then, up ahead, a car, old, pale blue, parked at the side of the road with its driver's side door open. I called out, but no answer. Just the sound of my own voice echoing back too softly. As I got closer, I saw the radio, not in the car, on the hood, waiting. I stopped walking, it turned on by itself. He's almost there. I didn't move. The static shifted. He just needs to remember. My hands were shaking now. "What do you want from me?" I asked. The speaker hissed. "He knows what he did. She cried for hours, and he never told her. He never said goodbye." My throat closed. I felt something press at the edges of my memory, like a picture trying to come into focus. "I didn't mean to," I began, but the radio cut me off. He's lying again. The radio's voice had changed. Still calm, still flat, but now with a tone like disappointment, like it knew me too well. He does this every time, pretends, runs, forgets. I stepped back from the car. My legs felt unsteady, like they didn't quite belong to me. The air was too still, too quiet. No birds, no wind. Just that crackling voice and the pressure behind my eyes building like a storm. "I didn't come here to forget," I said, louder now. "I just needed space, that's all." Silence, then. "She's still waiting." A chill spread through my chest. Not from the cold, from recognition. I told her I'd be back by dinner. Yes. I didn't think she'd care, not after what I said. She did, she always did. A memory surfaced, quick and sharp, the kitchen that morning. Her face tight with sadness, my keys in hand. The words I left hanging in the doorway. "I just need to breathe, okay? I'll be back before dark." I hadn't said goodbye, I hadn't even looked back. "I was going to call," I whispered. "You didn't." The radio hissed again, louder now, like static rising to a scream, then, suddenly, quiet. And then, "She's gone." That hit me like a punch to the ribs. "No," I breathed. "That's not... What are you talking about?" But the forest around me, if you could even still call it that, had changed. The trees bent unnaturally. The road behind me had disappeared. Even the car was starting to shift, the lines of it softening, melting into something less real. The radio spoke again, but it wasn't talking to me anymore. "He's almost ready." I turned. A figure stood a few feet away. Not a person, not exactly. It was me, but wrong. Paler, eyes sunken, clothes damp and torn, and in its hand, the radio. It smiled, not cruelly, almost gently, like it pitied me. Then it stepped aside. Behind it, the forest opened, not into more trees, but into a small room. Familiar. Too familiar. The kitchen. My kitchen. The smell of coffee. The faint hum of the fridge. The clock on the wall, stuck at 6:43 p.m. She stood at the table. Anna, back turned. Frozen. As if waiting, I stepped forward. "Anna," She didn't move. The static returned, louder now, like it was pressing against my eardrums. The radio in the figure's hand flared. He needs to say it. I'm sorry, I choked. I was wrong. I shouldn't have left. I should have stayed, should have said goodbye, should have... The room vanished, and I was back in the forest, alone, the clearing again, the radio at my feet, its voice now soft. He said it, but too late. I dropped to my knees. I just want to go home. A pause. Then, this is home now. The forest didn't shift. It didn't roar or scream. It simply accepted me, folded around me like a closing hand. The last thing I heard before the radio clicked off, before the world dimmed into a perpetual half-light, was my own voice, distorted through static. He took the wrong turn. He doesn't know yet, but he will.